Close your eyes and imagine a world before memory. A time when the first cities rose from the fertile soil between two rivers, when humanity gazed upward at the stars with a mixture of wonder and fear, and when the line between the mortal and the divine was not a metaphor but a boundary drawn in clay and blood. In this ancient landscape, nearly 6,000 years before our own time, a civilization emerged that would change the course of human history forever. The Sumerians, dwelling in the land of Mesopotamia, left behind more than crumbling temples and forgotten cities. They left us stories of beings they called the Anunnaki, gods who descended from the heavens to shape the destiny of the world and everything in it. This is not just the story of an ancient pantheon. This is the story of creation itself, of divine rivalries that shook the cosmos, of floods that drowned the world, and of a question that still haunts us today. Were the Anunnaki merely the products of human imagination, deities invented to explain the mysteries of existence? Or were they something more, something that challenges everything we think we know about our origins? Before we begin this journey into the depths of the ancient past, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself and let's dive in. The silence of the desert night is absolute. It wraps around you like a blanket woven from starlight and shadow. You stand on the edge of what was once the cradle of civilization, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers carved their patient paths through an unforgiving landscape. The air smells of dust and time, of secrets buried beneath layers of sand and centuries. This is Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, and you're about to witness the birth of something extraordinary. The year, if such measurements even matter in this twilight realm between history and myth, is somewhere around 4000 BCE. The world is young. Writing has not yet been invented. The wheel is still a dream waiting to be shaped from wood and necessity. Yet here, in this seemingly inhospitable place, something is stirring. Villages are growing into towns. Towns are evolving into something unprecedented, something that will change humanity forever. Cities. You walk through the pre-dawn darkness, your feet silent on soil that has absorbed the prayers and blood of countless generations. In the distance you see the first glimmers of firelight, not the scattered, random flames of a nomadic camp, but organised light, structured, purposeful. You are approaching what will become known as Eridu, the first city in human history, though to call it a city by our standards would be generous. It is more like a large village, perhaps 1,000 souls, clustered around a central temple complex, but it is the beginning of something revolutionary. For the first time in human history, people are choosing to live together in permanent settlements, to abandon the nomadic life that had sustained humanity for hundreds of thousands of years. And they are doing it for a reason that seems almost incomprehensible to our modern minds. They are doing it to serve the gods. The temple rises before you, a structure of mud brick and ambition. It is not large by later standards, not the towering ziggurats that will dominate the skyline in centuries to come, but it is monumental in its significance. This is the house of Enki, the god of wisdom and water, who the Sumerians believed had raised this very city from the primordial marshes. Inside, priests tend to the needs of an invisible presence, bringing offerings of food and drink, performing rituals whose meanings have been passed down through oral tradition from a time before memory, and according to those same traditions, the god himself once walked among them. The Anunnaki were not distant, abstract forces dwelling in some unreachable heaven. They were here, they were present, they were real. The Sumerian word Anunnaki has been the subject of intense scholarly debate for over a century. In the academic mainstream, the translation is straightforward and mundane. Princely offspring, those of royal blood, the children of An, the great sky god who ruled over the heavens. These were the principal deities of the Mesopotamian pantheon, the highest tier of divine authority. But embedded in that name is something that has captured the imagination of alternative researchers and theorists for decades. The word is composed of three elements: An, meaning heaven or sky, Unna, meaning seed or lineage, and Ki, meaning earth, those who from the heaven to the earth came. It is a translation that has been dismissed by most mainstream scholars as creative liberalization, a reading of modern ideas into ancient text, but it is a translation that resonates with something deep in the human psyche, a whisper that refuses to be silenced. What if they really did come from somewhere else? What if the gods were not metaphors at all, but memories? You step inside the temple, feeling the temperature drop as the thick mud brick walls shield you from the rising heat of the day. The interior is dim, lit only by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on walls covered in strange symbols. Not yet the familiar cuneiform script that will emerge in later centuries, but proto-writing, pictographs that represent not just objects but ideas, the very beginnings of humanity's attempt to capture thought itself in permanent form. On an altar at the far end of the temple sits a statue. It is crude by later artistic standards, barely anthropomorphic, more symbol than sculpture, but it represents something profound. This is the dwelling place of the god, not a representation of the god, not a symbol of divine presence. To the Sumerians, the statue was, in a very real sense, the god himself, inhabiting this physical form to be closer to the people who served him. The priests move with practiced precision, performing their morning rituals. They wash the statue, they dress it in fine linens, they present it with food, setting out plates of bread and meat, pouring fresh water and beer. To our modern eyes it might seem absurd, primitive superstition. But consider the implications of their actions. They were treating the statue exactly as they would treat a living being, an honoured guest, a master, someone who needed to be cared for, fed, maintained. And in their worldview, failure to perform these rituals had consequences. The god might become angry, might withdraw his protection, might bring drought or flood or disease upon the people who had neglected their duties. The relationship between humans and gods in ancient Sumer was not one of worship in the way we understand it today. It was a transaction, a contract. The gods provided order, protection, the fundamental structure that allowed civilization to exist. Humans provided service, labour, sustenance. And at the heart of this transaction was a belief that would echo through every myth and legend that followed. Humans were created for this purpose. We were not the pinnacle of divine creativity, the beloved children of benevolent creators. We were workers. We were made to serve. The sun rises higher, burning away the cool of the desert night. You leave the temple and walk through the narrow streets of Eridu, observing the rhythm of daily life in the world's first city. Farmers tend to irrigation canals that channel the precious water from the Euphrates to their fields of barley and wheat. Craftsmen work with copper and clay, creating tools and vessels with increasing sophistication. Children chase each other through the dusty lanes, their laughter a reminder that some things are eternal, transcending the boundaries of time and culture. But everywhere underlying every activity is an awareness of the divine presence. The gods are watching, the gods are judging, and the gods have expectations. Archaeological evidence tells us that Eridu was inhabited as early as 5400 BCE, making it one of the oldest permanent settlements in Mesopotamia. The site, located in what is now southern Iraq, was excavated extensively in the 1940s and revealed a fascinating pattern. At the lowest levels, archaeologists found simple shrines, small structures that gradually grew larger and more elaborate with each successive generation. By 4500 BCE, these shrines had evolved into substantial temple complexes, demonstrating a clear progression from simple ritual spaces to monumental architecture. What is particularly striking is that each new temple was built directly on top of the ruins of the previous one, maintaining the exact same orientation and location. The Sumerians were not simply building temples, they were maintaining a tradition, preserving a connection to something they believed was ancient and sacred. They were, in their understanding, rebuilding the house that the god himself had first established. The Sumerian king list, a document compiled around 2100 BCE but referencing much earlier traditions, begins with a statement that seems almost casual in its monumentality. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, not established, not invented, descended. The very concept of rulership of organised human society was a gift from the divine realm, and the first to receive this gift was the city of Enki, the god who loved humanity, who would become known as the craftsman god, the problem solver, the one deity in the Sumerian pantheon who consistently intervened on behalf of his human creations. The temple at Eridu itself underwent continuous transformation, each generation building upon the foundations laid by their ancestors. Archaeological excavations revealed 18 successive temple levels at the site, each more elaborate than the last, spanning nearly 2,000 years of continuous occupation and devotion. The earliest structures were simple shrines, barely more than a room with an altar. But by the Ubaid period, around 5000 BCE, these had evolved into substantial buildings with distinctive architectural features that would become hallmarks of Mesopotamian sacred architecture. The tripartite plan with a central hall flanked by rows of side rooms, the altar niche set into the wall, the offering table positioned precisely before it. These elements were not random choices but carefully planned components of a sacred technology, a system designed to facilitate communion between the human and divine realms. As you walk the perimeter of ancient Eridu in the gathering light, you can see the remnants of this architectural evolution embedded in the earth itself. Each layer of temple built directly upon its predecessor, maintaining the same sacred orientation, the same relationship to the cardinal directions. The Sumerians were not simply replacing old buildings with new ones. They were engaged in something more profound. They were maintaining continuity with the past, preserving the sanctity of the original site, ensuring that the connection between their city and the divine realm remained unbroken. When they demolished an old temple to build a larger one, they did so with reverence, carefully filling Enlil's old structure with clean sand, creating a platform for the new building that would rise from the accumulated devotion of centuries. This practice speaks to a fundamental aspect of Sumerian religious consciousness. Sacred space was not arbitrary. The gods had chosen specific locations for their earthly dwellings, and those locations retained their power across generations. To build elsewhere would be to abandon the divine presence, to sever the connection that made civilization possible. So they built upward, creating artificial mountains that lifted the temples closer to heaven, anticipating by millennia the massive ziggurats that would become the most recognizable monuments of Mesopotamian civilization. But Eridu was just the beginning. Over the following centuries, more cities would rise from the Mesopotamian plain. Uruk, which would grow to become the largest city in the world by 3000 BCE, home to an estimated 80,000 people. The legendary birthplace of Abraham, with its massive ziggurat dedicated to the moon god Nanna. Nippur, the religious centre of Sumer, where the god Enlil held his supreme authority. Lagash, Kish, Umma. Each city was a city-state, independent and often in conflict with its neighbours, but all sharing a common culture, a common language and a common understanding of the divine order. And at the head of that divine order stood the Anunnaki. The precise composition of this group varied depending on the time period and the specific text. Early Sumerian sources speak of 7 Anunnaki who decree the fates. These were the most powerful gods, the inner council of the divine assembly. An, the sky god, father of all the other deities, though he became increasingly distant and remote as Sumerian religion evolved. Enlil, the god of air and storms, who separated heaven from earth and became the chief administrator of the cosmos. Enki, also known by his Akkadian name Ea, the god of the subterranean freshwater ocean called the Abzu, master of wisdom, magic and crafts. Ninhursag, the mother goddess, also called Nintu or Mami, who presided over birth and creation. Nanna, the moon god whose steady cycles mark the passage of time. Utu, the sun god later known as Shamash, who brought light and justice. And Inanna, the goddess of love and war, one of the most complex and powerful figures in the entire pantheon, later syncretized with the Akkadian Ishtar. These 7 formed the core of the Anunnaki, but the term could expand to include many more deities. Some texts speak of 50 great gods, others mention 300 Anunnaki of heaven and 300 of the underworld, for a total of 600. The numbers are symbolic, representing completeness and totality rather than an actual census of divine beings. But what remains consistent across all the sources is the hierarchical nature of the divine realm. The Anunnaki were at the top. Below them were the Agigi, the younger gods who originally performed the labour that maintained the cosmos. And below them, after a pivotal moment in cosmic history, came humanity. The relationship between these divine tiers was not harmonious. It was fraught with tension, rivalry, and outright conflict. The myths that the Sumerians recorded on clay tablets were not morality tales or abstract philosophical meditations. They were family dramas, stories of dysfunction and power struggles that would make modern soap operas look tame by comparison. And at the centre of the most important of these dramas was a conflict that would change everything. A rebellion, a strike, a moment when the divine order itself broke down, forcing the gods to find a new solution to an old problem. And that solution was us. The story is preserved in a document known as the Atrahasis Epic, named after its human protagonist. Composed in Akkadian around 1700 BCE, though drawing on much older Sumerian traditions, it provides the most complete account we have of how and why humans were created according to Mesopotamian belief. The epic begins not with Earth, but with cosmic organization. In the beginning, when the gods were like humans, the universe was divided among the three great powers, and took the heavens. Enlil claimed the earth and everything upon it, and Enki descended into the Abzu, the subterranean ocean of fresh water that was thought to lie beneath the world. But this was not a paradise of divine leisure. There was work to be done, immense work. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers needed to be dug, irrigation canals had to be carved through the harsh earth. The foundations of civilization itself required labour, and someone had to do it. That someone was the Igigi, the younger generation of gods. For eons, by divine reckoning, they toiled. They dug the great rivers, they established the waterways, they built the infrastructure that would allow life to flourish in the harsh Mesopotamian environment, and they were miserable. The text describes their suffering in vivid terms. The work was heavy, the distress was much. They counted the years of toil, a staggering 3,600 years, each one marked by back-breaking labour and growing resentment. And then, finally, they broke. They burned their tools. They surrounded the house of Enlil in the middle of the night. It was a revolution, divine insurrection, the lesser gods refusing to continue their servitude. Enlil, the god of order and authority, was incensed. He viewed the rebellion as a fundamental threat to cosmic stability. His first instinct was to punish the rebels, to make an example of the ringleaders and force the others back to work. But the situation was more complex than a simple matter of discipline. The Igigi had a legitimate grievance. The work truly was too hard, the burden too great. Something had to change. It was Enki, the clever god, the problem solver, who proposed a solution, an elegant, practical, and ultimately disturbing answer to the divine labour crisis. Why not create a new being? A creature specifically designed to take over the work, a lulu, a mixed one, who would combine elements of the divine and the earthly into something entirely new. A being just intelligent enough to follow instructions and perform complex tasks, but not so intelligent as to question or rebel. A perfect worker, a save. The gods agreed to Enki's plan, but the implementation would require sacrifice. One of the Igigi, a god named Weilu, also called Geshtu-i, a deity described as having intelligence, was chosen. Or perhaps he volunteered, seeing it as the only way to end the suffering of his fellow workers. He was killed in a ritual sacrifice, his life ended, so that a new form of life could begin. And then came the crucial step, the moment of creation that would be remembered and retold across cultures and millennia. The mother goddess Nintu, with Enki guiding her, took clay from the Abzu, from the pure earth at the edge of the primordial waters. She mixed it with the flesh and blood of the sacrificed god. Divine essence merged with earthly matter, spirit combined with substance, and from this mixture she fashioned the first humans. The text is specific about the process in a way that is both ritualistic and disturbingly clinical. 7 pieces of the clay mixture were created for males, 7 for females. These were implanted into the wombs of 7 birth goddesses, divine surrogates who would gestate the first humans. A period of time passed, presumably analogous to a normal pregnancy, and then the moment arrived. Nintu announced her success. The work was completed. She had created the lulu, the primitive worker. Humanity was born. The implications of this creation story are profound and troubling. We were not made in love. We were not fashioned as the crowning achievement of a benevolent creator who wanted companions or children. We were manufactured as a solution to a labour dispute. Our very existence was predicated on service, on taking over the work that had become too burdensome for the divine labourers. The divine blood mixed into our clay gave us intelligence, the capacity for language and thought, the spark that separated us from the other animals. But it was not given as a gift. It was a feature, an engineered attribute that made us more useful for our intended purpose. We were designed to be smart enough to farm, to build, to follow complex instructions, but were we designed to be smart enough to understand what had been done to us? This is where the narrative takes on an almost uncomfortable resonance with certain alternative theories about human origins. The ancient astronaut hypothesis, popularized by authors like Erich von Däniken and most famously Zecharia Sitchin, looks at these creation myths and sees not symbolism but literal history. In this interpretation, the Anunnaki were not gods in any supernatural sense. They were extraterrestrial beings, visitors from another world, who came to Earth for specific resources, most notably gold. When their own workers rebelled, they turned to the primitive hominids already evolving on Earth, Homo erectus or a similar species, and genetically modified them, adding their own DNA to create Homo sapiens. We are, in this view, a hybrid species created through advanced biotechnology by beings who are themselves entirely material, entirely physical, just vastly more advanced than the creatures they were manipulating. Mainstream archaeology and anthropology reject this interpretation entirely. The evidence for human evolution through natural selection is overwhelming. We share DNA with every other living thing on Earth in a clear hierarchical pattern that demonstrates common descent. Our skeletal structure shows gradual changes over millions of years. There are no sudden leaps that would suggest genetic engineering. The development of Homo sapiens can be traced through a well-documented fossil record, from Australopithecus to Homo habilis, to Homo erectus, to Homo heidelbergensis, to Homo sapiens. Each step makes sense in the context of natural evolutionary pressures. We are not aliens, we are apes. Gloriously successful apes who developed large brains and complex culture, but apes nonetheless, products of this planet and its long evolutionary history. Yet the myths persist, the stories keep being told, and embedded in those stories is something that resonates at a deep, almost primal level. The feeling that there is something different about us, something that separates us from the natural world in ways that seem almost too dramatic to be explained by gradual change. The explosion of symbolic thought around 50,000 years ago, the sudden development of art, music, religion, sophisticated tool use. The Great Leap Forward, as it has been called, when behaviourally modern humans seem to emerge almost overnight in geological terms. Some researchers, operating at the fringes of accepted science, point to this period and ask uncomfortable questions. What if something did happen? Not alien intervention necessarily, but something that catalysed human development in ways we don't yet fully understand, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. We are standing in ancient Sumer, in the dawning light of civilization, and the story of the Anunnaki is just beginning. The humans have been created. The Agigi have been freed from their toil. The gods are satisfied with their solution. But as any engineer knows, new creations have a way of developing unexpected properties. And humanity, endowed with that divine spark of intelligence, would soon prove to be far more complicated than its creators had anticipated. The years passed. Generations of humans lived and died, serving the gods as they had been designed to do. They tended the fields, they maintained the temples, they brought offerings of food and drink, and they multiplied. This too was part of their design. They needed to reproduce to maintain the workforce. But there was a problem that the gods had not fully considered. Humans were very good at reproducing. Within what the myths describe as a relatively short time, certainly by divine standards, the human population exploded. Villages became towns, towns became cities, and with all those people came noise, constant, unrelenting, chaotic human noise. The sounds of daily life, children crying, people arguing, the general cacophony of a species that had developed language and was using it constantly. For most of the gods, this was merely an annoyance. But for Enlil, the chief administrator, the god of order and structure, it became intolerable. He could not sleep. He could not rest. The clamour of humanity rose up from the earth and disturbed his divine tranquillity, and so he decided to do something about it. The Atrahasis Epic describes a series of escalating calamities that Enlil sent to reduce the human population. First, he brought plague, a devastating disease that swept through human settlements and killed vast numbers. The humans, in their desperation, cried out to the gods for help. Enki, always the protector of humanity, told them what to do: offer prayers and sacrifices specifically to Namtar, the god of disease, flatter him, give him attention, and the plague would end. The humans did as instructed, and the plague subsided, but the population recovered, the noise returned, so Enlil tried again, this time with drought. He withheld the rains, crops failed, famine spread across the land. Again the humans appealed to Enki, and again he provided the solution. Pray to Adad, the storm god, make offerings, and the rains would return. It worked, but only temporarily. The cycle continued. Enlil would send a disaster. Enki would help the humans circumvent it. The population would recover, the noise would build, and Enlil's frustration would grow. Finally, the chief god had enough. He called a council of the Anunnaki and proposed a final solution. Disaster so complete, so total, that it would wipe out humanity entirely. He would send a flood, a deluge that would cover the entire world and drown every living thing. And this time, to ensure that Enki could not interfere, he made all the gods swear an oath of secrecy. No one was to warn the humans, humanity would be caught completely unprepared, and it would be eradicated. But Enki, the clever god, found a loophole. He could not directly warn humanity without breaking his oath, but perhaps he could warn something else. He went to the city of Shurapak, to the house of a particularly righteous and clever man named Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise. And standing outside the man's house, Enki began to speak, not to Atrahasis, to the wall of the house. "Reed wall," he said, speaking loudly enough for anyone inside to hear. "Reed wall, pay attention. Tear down your house and build a boat. Abandon your possessions and save your life. Bring the living creatures, the seed of all life, onto the boat. The flood is coming." Atrahasis, understanding perfectly what was happening, began to build. He constructed a massive vessel, sealing it with bitumen to make it watertight. He loaded his family, his possessions, and, critically, breeding pairs of all the animals he could gather. And then he waited. The flood came with terrifying suddenness. The text describes it in language that still resonates millennia later. The darkness was total. No one could see anyone else. They could not recognize each other in the catastrophe. The flood roared like a bull. The wind howled like a screaming eagle. For 6 days and 7 nights the world was drowned. Even the gods were terrified. This was not what they had expected. The violence of the flood, the sheer destructive power they had unleashed, was beyond anything they had anticipated. They cowered in the highest heaven like dogs, watching the world they had helped create being torn apart. And then came an unexpected consequence. The gods were hungry. Humans had been created not just to do physical labour, but to provide for the gods through offerings and sacrifices. With humanity destroyed, those offerings stopped. No more food, no more drink, no more sweet-smelling incense. The gods, it turned out, needed humans far more than they had realised. They began to regret their decision almost immediately. When the flood finally subsided, Atrahasis emerged from his boat. The first thing he did was make a sacrifice, burning offerings to the gods. The text describes the divine reaction with almost comical desperation. The gods smelled the sweet savour and gathered like flies over the sacrifice. They were starving, both literally and metaphorically, for the sustenance that only human devotion could provide. Enlil arrived and, seeing Atrahasis alive, immediately understood what had happened. He turned on Enki in fury, accusing him of breaking his oath and subverting the will of the council, but Enki stood his ground. He argued that destroying humanity entirely had been a mistake, an overreaction to a manageable problem. Yes, humans were noisy and numerous, but they were also necessary. The solution was not extermination, but population control. What followed was a negotiation, a divine compromise that would shape the future of humanity. The gods agreed that humans would be allowed to continue existing, but with certain built-in limitations to prevent the population from ever again growing too large. The mother goddess Nintu was instructed to create new conditions for human life. From now on, she decreed, not every woman would be able to bear children. Some would be barren, some children would die in infancy or before reaching adulthood, and some women would be consecrated to the temples, required to remain celibate and never reproduce. Death, disease, and reproductive limitations would keep human numbers in check. The noise would never again reach intolerable levels. Balance would be maintained. It is a dark conclusion to the story, an explanation for human suffering that is both pragmatic and disturbing. Every tragedy, every loss, every childless couple or dead infant was, in the Mesopotamian worldview, part of a cosmic population control system implemented by the gods after they nearly destroyed humanity entirely. It reframes suffering not as random or meaningless, but as functional, necessary, a built-in feature of the universe to prevent humans from overwhelming the world. Whether this makes suffering more bearable or more terrible is a question each person must answer for themselves. But there is another layer to this narrative that cannot be ignored. The flood story in the Atrahasis Epic predates the biblical account of Noah by at least 1,000 years. The parallels are unmistakable. A righteous man warned by a deity. a massive boat built to preserve life, animals taken aboard in pairs, a catastrophic flood that destroys the world, a mountain where the boat finally comes to rest, a sacrifice made after the waters recede. The similarities are so striking that even conservative biblical scholars acknowledge some form of literary relationship. The question is not whether there is a connection, but what that connection means. Did the Hebrew scribes who wrote the book of Genesis borrow from earlier Mesopotamian traditions? Almost certainly yes. The Israelites spent decades in Babylonian exile during the 6th century BCE and would have been exposed to these stories. But borrowing does not mean copying. The Genesis flood narrative takes the basic framework and transforms it theologically. In Genesis, the flood is not about noise or population control. It is about sin, about human wickedness and divine justice. God does not regret destroying humanity because he misses the sacrifices. He grieves because of the evil that necessitated such drastic action. And the covenant he makes with Noah afterward is not about limiting human reproduction, but about promising never again to destroy the world by flood, about establishing a new relationship between the divine and human realms. The transformation of the Mesopotamian material is profound, shifting from a universe where gods are petty, capricious, and self-interested to one where God is moral, just, and genuinely concerned with human welfare. But underneath the theological differences, the core narrative remains. There was a flood. Civilization was nearly destroyed. One family survived. Life began again. And this raises a question that has haunted archaeologists and geologists for over a century. Did something really happen? Is there a historical kernel, however small, at the centre of all these flood myths? The answer is complicated. There is no geological evidence for a global flood in the time frame suggested by these myths, roughly 3000 to 2000 BCE. The water simply does not exist on Earth to cover all the mountains, and if it did, there would be clear geological markers left behind. The fossil record shows no sudden mass extinction during this period, but there is evidence for significant regional flooding in Mesopotamia. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers were unpredictable and could flood catastrophically. Archaeological excavations at sites like Ur and Kish have revealed thick layers of river clay with no artifacts, sandwiched between occupational layers, suggesting that these cities were indeed flooded at some point. Not a flood that covered the entire world, but one that covered the entire known world from the perspective of people living in a relatively small geographical area. If you live in the lowlands of Mesopotamia and a massive flood destroys every settlement you know of, drowns everyone you can reach and lasts for weeks, it would certainly feel like the end of the world. Some researchers have proposed that the flood memories might preserve even older events, catastrophes from the end of the last ice age around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, when rising sea levels and melting glaciers caused massive flooding in various parts of the world. The Black Sea Deluge hypothesis, for instance, suggests that around 5600 BC, the Mediterranean Sea broke through a natural dam and flooded into the Black Sea basin, raising water levels by hundreds of feet and forcing the people living around the shores to flee. Could memories of such events have been passed down through oral tradition, eventually crystallizing into the flood narratives we find in Atrahasis and Genesis? It is possible, though impossible to prove definitively. What we can say with certainty is that the Sumerians believed in the flood. They believed it had happened. They believed it was divine retribution. And they believed that the few who survived did so because one of the gods, Enki, broke ranks with his fellow deities to save humanity. This image of Enki, the friend of humans, the god who repeatedly intervenes to protect his creations against the harsher measures proposed by his brother Enlil, would become central to Sumerian religion and culture. He was the god you prayed to when you needed help, when the world seemed hostile, when the other gods seemed uncaring. He was the closest thing the Mesopotamian pantheon had to an advocate for humanity. But Enki's advocacy had limits. He was not all-powerful. He operated within a divine hierarchy, constrained by the authority of Enlil and the consensus of the Anunnaki Council. And this limitation points to something important about how the ancient Mesopotamians understood their gods. They were not omnipotent, they were not omniscient, they were powerful, yes, vastly more powerful than humans, but they were also bound by rules, by obligations, by the same basic structures of authority and politics that governed human society. The gods had councils, they made deals, they argued, they formed factions, they competed for power and influence. This is a very different conception of divinity than what we find in later monotheistic traditions. The God of Judaism, Christianity and Islam is transcendent, beyond limitation, the ultimate source of all existence. The Anunnaki were immanent, operating within the cosmos rather than above it, subject to many of the same constraints as mortals. They could be fooled, they could be defied, they could be killed. And this meant that the relationship between gods and humans was more horizontal than vertical, more of a negotiation than a submission. Humans served the gods because it was practical, because the alternative was worse, not because the gods were inherently worthy of worship. It was a transactional relationship, and both parties understood it as such. The civilization that developed in Sumer over the following millennia was extraordinary by any measure. By 3000 BCE, Uruk alone had a population that might have reached 80,000 people, making it the largest urban centre in the world at that time. The city was a marvel of planning and engineering. Massive defensive walls, nearly 10 kilometres in circumference, encircled the urban core. The Epic of Gilgamesh, Sumer's most famous literary work, begins and ends with praise of these walls, inviting the reader to climb them and marvel at their construction. Inside the walls, the city was a maze of streets and buildings organised into districts based on occupation and family relationships. Potters had their quarter, weavers had theirs. The smell of baking bread mixed with the tang of copper being worked in open-air workshops. Merchants haggled in marketplaces over imports. From as far away as Afghanistan and the Indus Valley, lapis lazuli and carnelian and cedarwood. At the heart of Uruk stood two massive temple precincts. The Inanna district, dedicated to Inanna, the city's patron goddess, covered several city blocks and included not just temples but workshops and storerooms and administrative buildings. The Anu Ziggurat, a terraced platform rising towards the sky, was crowned with the White Temple, gleaming in the Mesopotamian sun. These were not just religious centres. They were economic powerhouses, the engines that drove the entire urban economy. The temples owned vast tracts of agricultural land. They employed thousands of workers. They collected taxes, stored surplus grain, and redistributed resources during times of scarcity. They were in a very real sense the first corporations, massive institutions that transcended individual lifetimes and operated according to complex bureaucratic rules. And managing this complexity required a new invention, one that would prove to be as revolutionary as the city itself. Writing. The earliest examples of writing, dating to around 3400 BC, were not literature or history. They were accounting records, tallies of goods received and distributed by the temple administrations, simple pictographs scratched into clay tablets, a circle with lines for cattle, a jar shape for oil. Gradually, these pictographs evolved into the wedge-shaped script we call cuneiform, capable of representing not just objects but sounds, making it possible to write in any language. And managing this complexity required a new invention, one that would prove to be as revolutionary as the city itself. Writing. The earliest examples of writing, dating to around 3400 BCE, were not literature or history. They were accounting records, tallies of goods received and distributed by the temple administrations, simple pictographs scratched into clay tablets, a circle with lines for cattle, a jar shape for oil. Gradually, these pictographs evolved into the wedge-shaped script we call cuneiform, capable of representing not just objects but sounds, making it possible to write in any language. The development of writing was not a sudden breakthrough, but a gradual evolution driven by practical necessity. As temple economies grew more complex, memory alone could not track all the transactions, all the debts and obligations, all the stored goods and distributed rations. The earliest clay tokens, used around 8000 BCE, were simple geometric shapes representing different commodities. A small cone for a measure of grain, a large cone for a larger measure. These tokens would be placed in clay envelopes, sealed, and marked on the outside to indicate what was inside. Eventually, someone realised that if you marked the envelope, you did not need the tokens at all. The marks themselves could convey the information. From this practical innovation emerged the first true writing system, a technology that would transform human civilization. The Sumerians did not just invent writing, they invented the concept of the scribe, the professional specialist whose life was dedicated to literacy. Scribal schools, called aduba or tablet houses, trained young men in the complex art of cuneiform. The training was rigorous, lasting for years, requiring the memorization of hundreds of signs and their variants, the mastery of multiple languages, Sumerian and Akkadian at minimum, and familiarity with mathematics, law, literature, and ritual procedure. Graduates of these schools formed an educated elite, capable of composing contracts, recording judicial decisions, managing temple accounts, and creating the literary works that give us our window into the Sumerian mind. Without these scribes, without their patient copying and preserving of texts across generations, we would know virtually nothing about the Anunnaki, or the civilization that worshipped them. The clay tablets themselves are remarkable artifacts. Unlike papyrus or parchment, which decay rapidly in most conditions, baked clay is virtually indestructible. Many tablets survived because they were accidentally fired in the conflagrations that destroyed the buildings where they were stored, transforming them from fragile sun-dried clay into ceramic that could survive millennia of burial. Archaeologists have recovered hundreds of thousands of these tablets, though only a small fraction have been fully translated and published. Each one is a voice from the past, a direct connection to individuals who lived and thought and worried about the same basic things we do. Bills to pay, disputes with neighbours, deaths in the family, and running through all of it, the constant awareness of the divine presence, the gods who watched and judged and demanded service. Beyond writing, the Sumerians pioneered innovations that we still use today. They invented the mathematical concept of place value, the idea that the position of a number determines its value, the foundation of all advanced mathematics. They divided the circle into 360 degrees, the hour into 60 minutes, the minute into 60 seconds, a sexagesimal system based on the number 60 that we have inherited directly from them. They developed sophisticated astronomical observations, tracking the movements of planets with remarkable precision, predicting eclipses, understanding the precession of the equinoxes. They created the first known pharmacopoeia, lists of medicinal plants and minerals and their uses for treating various ailments. They wrote the first law codes, establishing precedents for legal thinking that would influence all subsequent systems of justice. The Sumerians used it to record contracts, legal judgments, mathematical calculations, and, eventually, the stories that give us our window into their understanding of the world. Without cuneiform, we would know almost nothing about the Anunnaki. The clay tablets would remain silent, their secrets locked away, but thanks to the patient work of archaeologists and philologists over the past 150 years, the voices of the ancient Sumerians can speak to us again. What those voices tell us is both familiar and strange. The Anunnaki were not portrayed as perfect or even particularly moral. They were powerful, yes, and they provided the structure that made civilization possible. But they were also flawed, driven by the same petty motivations that plague humans: jealousy, pride, lust, anger, revenge. The myths are filled with divine dysfunction. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, is spurned by the hero Gilgamesh and responds by sending the bull of heaven to destroy his city, killing hundreds of innocent people in her wounded pride. When Gilgamesh and his companion Enkidu kill the bull, the gods decree that one of them must die as punishment. Enkidu is chosen and dies a slow, agonizing death from disease, and Gilgamesh is left to confront his own mortality in one of the most moving passages in ancient literature. Enlil and Enki, the two most powerful gods after their father An, were constantly at odds. They were half-brothers, sons of An by different mothers, and their rivalry shaped the cosmos. Enlil was the stern administrator, concerned with order, hierarchy, and maintaining cosmic law. Enki was the creative problem solver, more interested in possibility than propriety, willing to bend or break rules if it served a greater purpose. Their conflict over humanity was just one episode in a long saga of disagreements. In other myths, they compete for control of the me, the fundamental laws or decrees that govern everything from kingship to carpentry. Enki, as the original keeper of the me, has them stolen by Inanna, who gets him drunk and tricks him into giving them to her. When he sobers up and realizes what he has done, he sends demons to retrieve them, but Inanna escapes and brings the me to her city, Uruk, increasing its prestige and power. This story, like so many Sumerian myths, operates on multiple levels. On the surface, it explains why Uruk became the dominant city, why its goddess Inanna/Ishtar was so powerful, but underneath it is about knowledge, about who has access to power and why, about the tension between established authority and disruptive ambition. And it portrays the gods not as omniscient beings with perfect plans, but as flawed individuals who make mistakes, who can be outmaneuvered, who are subject to very human weaknesses like intoxication and poor judgment. If these are the beings who created humanity, the myths seem to ask, is it any wonder that we inherited their flaws? The question of creation loomed large in Mesopotamian thought. Multiple versions of creation myths circulated, sometimes contradicting each other in details while agreeing on broad themes. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic composed around 1100 BCE, though drawing on earlier Sumerian material, tells a dramatically different version of cosmic origins than the Atrahasis. In this, creation begins with primordial chaos, personified as two deities. Apsu, the fresh water, and Tiamat, the salt water, mingle together in the darkness before anything has been named or given form. From their union, younger gods emerge, including eventually Enki and Anu, but the younger gods are noisy and disturb Apsu's rest. Sound familiar? The motif repeats. Noise is intolerable to those in power. Apsu plots to destroy the younger gods. Ea discovers the plan, recites a spell that puts Apsu to sleep and kills him. This enrages Tiamat, who creates an army of monsters and dragons to avenge her slain consort. The gods are terrified. None of them are strong enough to face Tiamat and her monstrous horde. Finally, Marduk, the son of Ea, offers to champion the gods, but he demands a price. If he defeats Tiamat, he must be made supreme ruler of the pantheon. The gods agree, desperate for any solution. Marduk arms himself with winds and storms, rides into battle on his chariot, and confronts the Chaos Dragon. The battle is cosmic in scale. Marduk captures Tiamat in a net, sends the evil wind into her mouth to distort her body, and shoots an arrow through her heart, killing her. Then, in an act of supreme creativity and violence, he splits her corpse in two. From one half, he creates the heavens. From the other, he creates the earth. He organizes the cosmos, assigns the sun, moon, and stars their courses, establishes the calendar, and brings order to what had been chaos. And then, after creating the world from Tiamat's body, Marduk turns to the question of humanity. He asks which of the gods incited Tiamat to rebellion. The answer is Chingu, her consort and general. Chingu is executed, and from his blood mixed with clay, Ea creates humanity. The purpose is explicit. Humans are to bear the service of the gods so that the gods may be at leisure. We are not created as punishment for a rebellion, as in the Atrahasis. We are created from the blood of a rebel god, which gives us, the text suggests, a certain inherent tendency toward insubordination. It is a different explanation for the same observed reality. Humans serve the gods, but humans also resist, rebel, push boundaries. We inherited rebellion in our very substance. The Enuma Elish was not just a creation myth, it was a political document. The epic was recited annually during the Akitu festival, the Babylonian New Year celebration, which occurred in the spring. On the fourth day of the 11-day festival, priests would chant the entire text in front of the statue of Marduk in the Asagula temple in Babylon. It was a ritual affirmation of Marduk's supremacy and, by extension, Babylon's right to rule Mesopotamia. The myth justified empire. It explained why Babylon, a relatively late arrival on the Mesopotamian scene, should dominate older, more established cities. Marduk defeated the forces of chaos. He created the world. He organized the cosmos. Therefore, his city deserves to rule, and its king, as Marduk's earthly representative, deserves absolute obedience. This political function of mythology is important to understand. The ancient Mesopotamians did not experience a separation between religion and politics, between the sacred and the secular. They were the same thing. Religious authority was political authority. The king was the link between the divine and human realms, the one who ensured that the gods remained pleased and that cosmic order was maintained. And the myths, far from being simple stories, were complex ideological statements about power, legitimacy, and the proper structure of society. When Babylon replaced Sumer as the dominant power, the myths changed to reflect that new reality. Marduk, originally a relatively minor agricultural deity, was elevated to supreme god status. The old Sumerian gods were not erased, but they were subordinated to Marduk in the theological hierarchy, just as the Sumerian cities were subordinated to Babylonian rule. This process, called syncretism, happened repeatedly in Mesopotamian history. As different peoples conquered the region, they absorbed and adapted the existing religious traditions. The Akkadians, a Semitic people who conquered Sumer around 2034 BCE under their king Sargon, maintained the Sumerian gods but gave them Akkadian names. Enlil became Elil, Enki became Ea, Inanna became Ishtar. The myths themselves were translated into the Akkadian language, and new elements were added that reflected Akkadian concerns and values. Later, when the Babylonians rose to power, they performed the same operation, keeping the tradition alive while reshaping it to serve their purposes. And still later, the Assyrians, based in northern Mesopotamia, elevated their own patron god Ashur to supreme status while still acknowledging the older Anunnaki. What is remarkable is how persistent the core tradition remained despite all these changes. For over 3,000 years, from the dawn of Sumerian civilization around 3500 BCE to the fall of Babylon to the Persians in 539 BCE, the Mesopotamian religious system remained recognizable. The Anunnaki, in one form or another, were always there. The myths of creation, flood, and divine interaction with humanity were continuously retold, adapted, but never abandoned. It was not until the rise of monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that the old gods were finally displaced, transformed from deities into demons or simply forgotten. But their influence did not disappear. It was absorbed into the new religious systems, detectable in the structure of creation narratives, flood stories, apocalyptic visions. The Anunnaki faded from direct worship, but their shadows remained, haunting the foundations of Western religious thought. In 1976, a man named Zecharia Sitchin published a book that would resurrect the Anunnaki for the modern age. The 12th Planet was not an academic work. Sitchin was not a trained archaeologist or linguist. He was an economic journalist born in Azerbaijan, raised in Palestine, with a background in business and a passion for ancient history. But what he lacked in formal credentials, he made up for in ambition and imagination. His thesis was simple, radical, and enormously influential. Everything the ancient Sumerians wrote about the Anunnaki was literally true. They were not gods, they were extraterrestrials, they were not myths, they were history. And hidden in the ununiform texts was a complete account of human origins, alien intervention, and the true history of Earth. Sitchin's theory rested on several key claims. First, he argued that the Sumerians knew about all the planets in our solar system, including ones not discovered by modern astronomy until the 18th and 19th centuries. He pointed to a particular cylinder seal known as VA243, which shows a star surrounded by what he interpreted as 11 spheres, representing the Sun, Moon, and 9 planets, plus one additional body. This 12th member of the solar system, Sitchin claimed, was Nibiru, a massive planet on a highly elliptical orbit that brings it into the inner solar system every 3,600 years. According to his interpretation of Sumerian cosmology, Nibiru was the homeworld of the Anunnaki. Second, he argued that the word Anunnaki itself revealed their true nature. While scholars translated it as princely offspring or those of royal blood, Sitchin offered a more literal reading. Those who from heaven to earth came, not metaphorically, but physically. The Anunnaki were astronauts, he claimed, visitors from another planet who arrived on Earth approximately 450,000 years ago on a mission to extract gold. Why gold? Because according to Sitchin's interpretation of the texts, Nibiru's atmosphere was failing, and its inhabitants needed vast quantities of gold to create reflective particles that could be suspended in the upper atmosphere to retain heat and light. Earth was rich in gold and thus became the target of an extraterrestrial mining operation. Third, he reinterpreted the Atrahasis story of humanity's creation as an account of genetic engineering. When Enki mixed clay with the blood of a god to create humans, Sitchin argued, this was not metaphor but a description, filtered through ancient language and understanding of in vitro fertilization and DNA manipulation. The clay was the egg of a female hominid, probably Homo erectus. The blood of the god was Anunnaki sperm or DNA. The womb goddesses who gestated the first humans were Anunnaki females serving as surrogate mothers. The result was a hybrid species, combining the biology of Earth with the advanced genetics of an alien race, created for the express purpose of working in the gold mines. We were manufactured, we were engineered, and our creators, Sitchin claimed, documented the entire process in texts we have dismissed as mythology. The mainstream academic response to Sitchin's work was swift and unambiguous. His theories were rejected on multiple grounds. Linguists pointed out that his translations were wildly inaccurate, that he manipulated the meanings of words to fit his preconceived narrative, and that he had no real understanding of Sumerian or Akkadian grammar. The cylinder seal VA243, which he claimed showed our solar system, was almost certainly just a star with decorative elements, a common motif in Mesopotamian art. The idea that Nibiru exists on a 300-600-year orbit is astronomically impossible. Such a planet would have gravitational effects on the outer planets that would be easily detectable, and no such effects have been observed. Moreover, any planet with such an eccentric orbit would be incredibly unstable, and likely to be ejected from the solar system or crash into another body over millions of years. The genetic engineering claim fares no better under scrutiny. The human genome has been fully sequenced, and it shows unambiguous evidence of evolution through natural selection. We share over 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees, over 90% with mice, significant amounts with fruit flies and even bacteria. This nested hierarchy of genetic similarity matches exactly what we would expect if all life on Earth shared common ancestors. There is no alien DNA in the human genome. There are no sequences that cannot be explained through natural evolutionary processes. We are not hybrids. We are thoroughly terrestrial, products of this planet's 4 billion-year biological history. And yet, despite the overwhelming rejection by scholars and scientists, Sitchin's book sold millions of copies. They were translated into dozens of languages. They spawned a movement, a subculture of believers who saw in the ancient astronaut theory something that mainstream science could not or would not provide. An explanation for human origins that was both scientific and mythic, that validated ancient texts while embracing modern technology, that answered deep existential questions about who we are and why we are here. The Anunnaki became, for this community, not gods or myths, but ancestors, our literal progenitors, the extraterrestrial engineers who made us what we are. Why did this idea resonate so powerfully? Part of the answer lies in the timing. Sitchin's book appeared in the mid-1970s, during a period of intense interest in UFOs, ancient mysteries, and around alternative history. Erich von Däniken's Chariots of the Gods had been published in Hayat and became an international sensation, arguing that many ancient sites and texts could only be explained by extraterrestrial intervention. The space race had made the idea of travelling between worlds seem not just possible, but imminent. We had walked on the moon. Surely other species, older and more advanced, could have visited Earth in the distant past. The cultural moment was ripe for ideas that challenged conventional wisdom and offered grand, unifying theories that connected disparate mysteries. But there is something deeper at work as well. Sitchin's theory, despite its rejection by scholars, addresses a genuine problem. The Sumerian civilization appeared seemingly out of nowhere, with writing, cities, complex social organization, and sophisticated knowledge already in place. The standard historical narrative is that these things developed gradually over centuries, but the archaeological record shows a relatively rapid transition from village life to urban civilization. Between 4000 and 3000 BCE, in 1,000 years, Mesopotamia went from scattered farming communities to city-states with tens of thousands of inhabitants. That is an extraordinarily fast transformation by historical standards. Something catalyzed it. Some set of factors came together to enable this leap forward. Mainstream historians point to environmental factors, the unique hydrology of the Tigris-Euphrates river system, the development of irrigation technology, the emergence of administrative structures to manage communal resources. But to some, these explanations feel insufficient. They do not account for the feeling of discontinuity, the sense that the Sumerians themselves had that their civilization was given to them, handed down from the gods rather than built up from scratch. This is where mythology and history become tangled in ways that are difficult to separate. The Sumerians believed their civilization came from the gods. They said so explicitly in their texts. The king list states that kingship descended from heaven. The temple hymns credit Enki with teaching humans the arts of civilization. The myths portray the Anunnaki as the source of knowledge, the ones who gave humans writing, law, agriculture, architecture. From the perspective of ancient Mesopotamians, there was no question about it. The gods were real, they had been present in the distant past, and civilization was their gift to humanity. Modern scholars translate this into naturalistic terms. The gods were projections of human psychology, personifications of natural forces, symbolic representations of social and political structures. The myths were not historical accounts, but ideological statements. ways of understanding and legitimizing the world as it existed. No actual gods were involved. But what if we take a middle path? What if the Sumerians were describing something real, but through a cultural and linguistic filter that makes it almost unrecognizable to modern eyes? Not aliens with spaceships, but perhaps a more advanced human culture. A civilization that existed in the prehistorical period and passed on knowledge to the emerging Sumerian cities. Or a contact event of some kind that was interpreted through the only framework available, the framework of divine intervention. This is, of course, highly speculative. There is no concrete evidence for such a scenario, but it is worth noting that we still have enormous gaps in our understanding of human prehistory. Only a tiny fraction of ancient sites have been excavated. Countless texts remain untranslated, sitting in museum storage or still buried in the ground. New discoveries continue to push back the timeline of human achievement. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, for instance, is a massive temple complex built around 9600 BCE, thousands of years before the advent of agriculture, forcing archaeologists to revise their assumptions about the capabilities of hunter-gatherer societies. If humans could build sophisticated monumental architecture before they had settled down to farm, what else might they have achieved that we have not yet discovered? The story of the Anunnaki, whether taken literally, symbolically, or somewhere in between, poses fundamental questions about civilization, power, and human nature. It presents a universe where we were created to serve, where our very existence is predicated on labour, where the structure of reality itself is hierarchical, with the powerful demanding service from those beneath them. This is not a comforting vision. It does not offer the warm reassurance that we are beloved children of a benevolent creator. Instead, it suggests that we are products, manufactured for a purpose. That purpose is not our own fulfillment but the convenience of others. And yet, embedded in these dark narratives are moments of resistance and hope. Enki, the friend of humanity, repeatedly defies the cosmic order to protect his creations. He warns Atrahasis of the flood. He teaches humans the arts and sciences. He intervenes on humanity's behalf, even when it costs him politically with the other gods. In the Sumerian version of the story, Enki is not all-powerful, not capable of simply overruling Enlil's decrees, but within the constraints of his authority, he does what he can. He finds loopholes. He bends rules. He acts as an advocate for those without power. This image of Enki has made him, in some modern interpretations, a Promethean figure, the god who gives humans fire, knowledge, autonomy, even if it means opposing the divine establishment. The persistence of this narrative pattern, the helpful deity who sides with humans against more authoritarian gods, can be found across cultures. Prometheus in Greek mythology steals fire from the gods and gives it to humans, suffering eternal torment as punishment. Loki in Norse mythology, while often malicious, also challenges the established order, and helps humanity indirectly. Even in Christianity, the serpent in Eden, later identified with Satan, is the one who offers Eve the fruit of knowledge, the one who suggests that perhaps humans do not need to remain in ignorant obedience. These rebel figures are morally ambiguous. They cause problems, they disrupt order, but they also enable human progress, human independence, the capacity to think and choose for ourselves. If we read the Anunnaki myths as metaphors for human psychological and social development, they can be understood as encoding fundamental truths about the human condition. We do live in hierarchical structures. We do perform labour for others. We are, in a sense, created by our culture and shaped by the expectations and demands placed upon us by family, society, and tradition. The question of whether we accept that condition passively or struggle against it, whether we remain obedient servants or become autonomous agents, is central to human experience. The gods of Mesopotamia were not offering liberation. They were offering structure, order, survival. Within that structure, there was always the possibility of resistance, always the clever god whispering through the reed wall that perhaps there is another way. As Sumerian civilization evolved into Babylonian and then Assyrian and Persian, and finally faded into history, the Anunnaki faded with it. The last cuneiform tablets were written in the 1st century CE, nearly 2,000 years after the fall of the Sumerian state. For over a millennium, the stories of the Anunnaki were forgotten, the clay tablets buried in the sands of Iraq, the temples crumbling into shapeless mounds. It was not until the 19th century that European archaeologists, initially searching for sites mentioned in the Bible, began to uncover the remains of Mesopotamian civilization. Austin Henry Layard, excavated Nineveh. Paul Emil Botter worked at Khorsabad. Leonard Woolley uncovered Ur, including its spectacular royal tombs filled with gold and lapis lazuli. And slowly, painstakingly, scholars began to decipher the strange wedge-shaped writing that covered thousands of clay tablets. Henry Rawlinson, Edward Hincks, Jules Opper, and others compared known trilingual inscriptions, using the same technique that had been applied to Egyptian hieroglyphics with the Rosetta Stone. By the late 19th century, Sumerian and Akkadian could be read again, and the ancient voices began to speak. The myths were recovered, the epics were translated, and the world learned for the first time in nearly 2 millennia about the Anunnaki. The rediscovery of Mesopotamian literature had a profound impact on biblical scholarship. It became clear that many stories in the Hebrew Bible had earlier Mesopotamian parallels. The creation narrative in Genesis echoed the Enuma Elish. The flood story was nearly identical to the Atrahasis and Gilgamesh accounts. The Garden of Eden might be related to the Sumerian myths of Dilmun, a paradisiacal land where the gods dwelt. For some scholars, this was evidence that the Bible was not unique divine revelation, but a product of its cultural context, borrowing from older traditions. For others, it confirmed that the biblical narratives preserved ancient truths, historical events that were remembered in multiple cultures. The debate continues to this day, with profound implications for how we understand the relationship between mythology, history, and religious faith. But the rediscovery of the Anunnaki also raised new questions. If these were just myths, why did they feel so specific? Why did they contain such detailed information about cosmic organization, divine hierarchies, human origins? Why did the Sumerians insist so strongly that these were not stories but history? And most puzzling of all, how did a civilization that appeared so suddenly, with so little apparent precedent, achieve such sophistication in such a short time? These questions do not have easy answers, and in the absence of easy answers, alternative theories flourish. The ancient astronaut hypothesis, despite its rejection by mainstream scholarship, continues to evolve and attract adherents. It has been popularized by television shows like Ancient Aliens, which has aired hundreds of episodes presenting evidence, often highly speculative or misinterpreted, for extraterrestrial intervention in human history. The Anunnaki feature prominently in this narrative, portrayed as literal aliens from Nibiru who came to Earth, created humans through genetic manipulation, and ruled over us as gods. The pyramids, Stonehenge, the Nazca Lines, megalithic structures around the world, all are explained as the work of the Anunnaki or their human servants, built with technology far beyond what we assume ancient peoples possessed. The appeal of these ideas is easy to understand. They offer simple answers to complex mysteries. They provide a grand narrative that connects disparate pieces of evidence into a coherent whole. They validate ancient texts that mainstream science dismisses as mythology. And perhaps most importantly, they satisfy a deep human need to believe that we are not alone, that we are part of a larger cosmic story, that our origins are special, and our future is connected to beings more advanced than ourselves. It is a modern mythology, built on ancient foundations, serving many of the same psychological and social functions that the original myths served for the Sumerians. It provides meaning, structure, explanation. It tells us who we are and where we came from. But as with any belief system, we must ask, what is the cost? When we accept ideas that are not supported by evidence, when we prioritize compelling narratives over rigorous investigation, we risk losing touch with reality in ways that can be harmful. Science is not perfect. It is a human endeavor subject to bias, error, and institutional inertia. But it is also the best method we have for distinguishing truth from fiction, for building reliable knowledge about the world. The scientific consensus is not that the Anunnaki theory is wrong, because scientists are closed-minded or conspiratorial. It is that the evidence does not support it. The texts do not say what proponents claim. The archaeological record does not show what the theory requires. The genetic, geological, and astronomical data contradict the core claims. This does not mean the Anunnaki are not worth studying. Quite the opposite. Understanding what the ancient Mesopotamians actually believed, how their myths functioned in their society, what these stories reveal about human psychology and culture, these are valuable pursuits. The Anunnaki, as historical deities in one of humanity's earliest civilizations, are endlessly fascinating. They were not aliens, but they were something perhaps even more interesting. They were an attempt to understand the universe, to explain suffering, to make sense of power and hierarchy, to grapple with the fundamental questions of existence using the conceptual tools available at the time. The myths tell us that humans were created to serve the gods. Modern science tells us that humans evolved through natural processes over millions of years, that we are products of chance and necessity, that there was no designer and no purpose. Both narratives, in their own way, can feel bleak. In the mythological version, we are slaves, manufactured for someone else's convenience. In the scientific version, we are accidents, meaningless products of blind evolutionary forces. But there is another way to understand both narratives. The myths, by making us creations of the gods, also make us kin to the divine. We carry divine blood, divine intelligence, divine spark. We are connected to the cosmic order, part of the grand story of existence. The scientific narrative, by making us products of nature, also makes us part of the web of life, connected to every other living thing on Earth, shaped by the same forces, subject to the same laws. We are not separate from nature. We are its flowering, its culmination, at least so far, and both narratives, mythological and scientific, leave room for something essential. Freedom, the capacity to choose. The Sumerian myths show us gods who are not omnipotent, who can be resisted, whose plans can be subverted. They show us Enki breaking his oath to warn Atrahasis. They show us Inanna stealing the me from her father. They show us humans surviving the flood, creating civilization, building empires. The narrative is not one of passive obedience, but of constant negotiation, struggle, resistance. And the scientific narrative shows us a species that evolved the capacity for consciousness, for culture, for the ability to understand and shape our own development. We are not determined by our genes or our environment. We have agency. We can choose what kind of beings we want to become. The story of the Anunnaki, then, is not just about ancient gods or alien visitors. It is about us. It is about how we understand ourselves, our origins, our place in the universe. It is about the tension between authority and freedom, between service and autonomy, between accepting the world as it is and imagining how it might be different. The Sumerians told these stories because they needed to make sense of their world. We retell them, reinterpret them, argue about them because we need the same thing. We need stories that help us understand who we are and what we are doing here on this small planet orbiting an unremarkable star in the vastness of space. The clay tablets are silent now. The temples are ruins. The cities of Sumer are dust and memory. But the questions remain. The mysteries endure. And as long as humans gaze up at the stars and wonder if we are truly alone, as long as we dig in the earth and uncover the remnants of vanished civilizations, as long as we ask where we came from and why we are here, the story of the Anunnaki will continue to be told. Not because it is literally true in the way its ancient believers thought, and not because it is true in the way modern alternative theorists claim, but because it contains truths of a different kind. Truths about human nature, about power, about creativity and rebellion, about the eternal struggle between order and chaos, about our deep need to connect the heavens and the earth, to bridge the gap between what we are and what we might become. In the end, whether the Anunnaki were gods, aliens, or simply powerful symbols created by an ancient people trying to make sense of their world, they remain with us. They whisper to us from the clay, offering their strange and troubling wisdom. We were made to serve, they tell us. But we were also given the spark of intelligence, the capacity to resist, to question, to imagine a different way. We are children of earth and sky, mud and starlight, bound by our origins but not determined by them. And that, perhaps, is the deepest truth embedded in these ancient myths. We are more than we were made to be. We are more than our creators, whoever or whatever they were, intended. We are, in the final analysis, free to write our own story. The night deepens around you. The stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance, the same stars the Sumerians watched 6,000 years ago, wondering if the gods still walked among them. In the silence of the desert, you can almost hear the echo of their voices, the priests chanting in the temples, the scribes carefully pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay, preserving their stories for a future the sea could not imagine, a future where their gods would be studied by people who no longer believe in them, where their myths would be debated by scholars and theorists, where their deepest religious truths would become our historical curiosities. But perhaps they would not be troubled by this transformation. Perhaps they understood better than we give them credit for that truth takes many forms, that stories can be both fictional and true, that the boundary between myth and reality is more permeable than we like to admit. They were not primitive, despite our tendency to view them that way. They were fully human, as intelligent and complex as we are, grappling with the same fundamental questions that haunt us still. And they left us their answers, inscribed in imperishable clay, waiting patiently in the darkness for someone to read them and understand. The Anunnaki are gone, the gods have left the earth, but their story remains, a testament to human creativity, to our unending attempt to understand ourselves and our world, to make meaning from chaos, to transform the random accidents of existence into a narrative that makes sense. And in that effort, that ancient and eternal human effort, we find not just the story of the Anunnaki, but our own story reflected back at us, asking us still, after all these millennia, the questions that matter most. Who are we? Why are we here? What were we meant to become? And perhaps most important of all, are we free to answer those questions for ourselves? The silence of the desert offers no answer. But in that silence you realise lies the answer itself. The questions are ours to ask. The meanings are ours to make. The future is ours to shape. Whether we were created by gods, engineered by aliens, or evolved through the patient work of natural selection, we stand now at a moment of genuine agency, genuine choice. We are no longer bound by the intentions of creators long vanished. We are, for better and worse, on our own. And that terrifying, exhilarating freedom is perhaps the greatest inheritance the Anunnaki, real or imagined, could have left us. Sleep now and dream of the ancient world. Dream of the first cities rising from the river plains. Dream of the gods walking among mortals, teaching and commanding, creating and destroying. Dream of a time when the line between heaven and earth was not an absolute barrier, but a boundary that could be crossed, a threshold that invited passage. And when you wake, carry with you the knowledge that you are the heir to the oldest story, the descendant of those first humans who looked up at the stars and asked if they were alone. You are part of an unbroken chain stretching back to the dawn of civilization and forward into an unknowable future. You are, in the most profound sense, both servant and rebel, creator and destroyer, bound by your origins and free to transcend them. You're human, and that is enough.